Just run away please." The beastmen couldn't hear her, nor would they probably oblige her even if they could. High above the Royal Army's front north of Eastwatch, Olga scowled down at her increasingly numerous opponents as they continued their stubborn resistance against the advance of the undead. 20 kilometers to the south, the fortress city loomed over its surroundings, a dark silhouette behind sheets of endless rain. It wasn't very far, even for a zombie, but, since she had cleared her way to the fortress on the river that marked the eastern border of the Draconic Kingdom, her progress had slowed to a tiny fraction of what she had achieved before. Olga and her northern spearhead had arrived way before the others, so a fanciful part of her entertained the thought of taking Eastwatch before anyone else arrived. That was before she saw how many beastmen there were, and how annoying they were to fight. "Squad 6 is ready to advance," the Elder Lich riding behind her said. She reviewed the features of the village below. If anyone were to describe it, it would be a normal village, but every village was different. Those differences usually meant nothing to anyone but the people who lived there, but they couldn't be ignored when a village became a battlefield. The collection of buildings rested on a gentle swell, but it wasn't so high that it offered a good view of the countryside. A low wall of stone held together by mortar, not much more than a fence, enclosed it. The buildings within were wood-framed and walled with panels of wattle and daub. Every home was roofed with thatch and the village's layout was organized around 4 wells arranged in a rough square. In all, it was a village one could probably find anywhere. A normal village with 300 of the Draconic Kingdom's citizens still inside. Just shy of 10,000 beastmen were lurking in and around it, treating it as a makeshift defensive position. "Squads 5 and 7 are ready to advance," the Elder Lich said. The 3 infantry squads were arranged in 3 groups facing the village. The beastmen were arranged in a semicircle parallel to them. Each squad of Death Series servitors was enough to devastate a country, but things were more complicated than that in practice. At best, she would say that they could devastate a country, but that would take a very long time and rely on the country's defenders standing around like idiots waiting to be killed in a long series of stupid duels. In her case, collateral damage was also a very real and serious issue. Area of effect spells such as Fireball were absolutely out of the question inside the village. Stray crossbow bolts from Death Warriors could punch through the walls of buildings to kill their occupants. They had been playing an entirely different game from the Beastmen throughout their advance, and the Beastmen were now unknowingly benefiting from the rules of that game. In addition to all that, there were the regular considerations that factored into warfare. "All right," Olga said. "Let's do this." The 3 squads steadily advanced through the muddy fields. A kilometer away, the Beastman ranks came alive with activity. Each squad was in a tight formation learned from the Azalisian mountain dwarves for use against the frost giants, though these formations were much smaller than the original. They made a little box with their shields, in which the other members of their squad took shelter. Additionally, there were 2 guest Elder Liches drawn from the ranks of the undead controllers present for magical support. Having the Elder Liches fly above the army for both safety and better visibility was quickly proven to be a bad idea against the new arrivals from upriver. They were far more numerous and organized, and their rank and file was generally stronger. This included their hunters, which resulted in vastly improved battlefield awareness for the Beastman forces. Her Elder Liches were detected long before the Elder Liches could detect the enemy, and she had very nearly lost a few not long after she started pushing south. Even invisibility didn't seem to help. Additionally, they had lost dozens of bone vultures before relegating them to high-altitude observation. As the Beastmen saw more, the Sorceress Kingdom's forces saw less. It was something that the legends never related. Before a single drop of blood was shed, a war for information was already being waged. From the start of the campaign, Olga had taken the advantages they were enjoying in that regard for granted. Now that they were losing that war, she keenly felt why Lady Zaradnik adamantly called for more reconnaissance assets in the Royal Army. In terms of visible changes, the most noticeable was that the undead horde was gone. They had been left in reserve because they were a distraction at best in skirmishes, and the general staff wanted to preserve their numbers for storming Eastwatch. For the Beastmen's part, they didn't seem to care that the horde was missing. There was a war to be won, and the enemy was the enemy, no matter how they appeared. A cacophony of clanks and thunks rose from the advancing infantry formations. Since their melee weapons were useless while closing distance with the enemy, all of the Death Knights were wielding 2 shields, the second being a door, broken wagon bed, or even bales of hay that they picked up from the previous village. "Can they go any faster?" Olga asked. "We need to get as far as we can before those temporary shields break." That was yet another thing that Olga swiftly learned upon arriving at the border. Despite how it looked, the beastmen weren't pointlessly flinging bullets of stone, clay and lead into a wall of metal. With the shields in the way, they couldn't damage the undead, so they simply focused on damaging the shields with ranged sundering attacks. Magic had mostly been a mystery to her before arriving in Warden's Vale, but martial arts, skills, and abilities were even more so. Just like magic, it seemed like they could do anything and their enemy had far too much at their disposal. 300 meters from the enemy lines, their makeshift shields started to disintegrate. The Death Knights stopped so the Elder Liches could cast fog cloud between themselves and the Beastmen. The Death Warriors took the opportunity to send a few crossbow quarrels at the Beastmen that didn't have buildings behind them, sending several sprawling to the ground. The hail of bullets ceased a dozen or so seconds later, and the squads resumed their advance. Orange flares flashed through the fog as the undead closed with the enemy lines. Fireballs exploded across the muddy fields. The Elder Liches were trying to estimate where the Beastmen in the surrounding fields were based on their last known positions, but it was all in vain. "Save your mana," Olga said. "They're on their way out. Try to catch some in the village if you can. Watch out for traps and ambushes." She wasn't sure if the warning at the end even mattered. Within 10 seconds, a Death Warrior charging up the village lanes in hopes of finding something to fight triggered a trap. The simple snare broke, but not before making the Death Warrior fall flat on its face. From the far side of the village, bullets whistled in to pummel the prone soldier. By the time a nearby Death Knight arrived to cover its squadmate with its tower shield, the Beastmen were gone. A Death Priest arrived shortly after to heal the damage. Nearby, a Death Knight kicked a tripwire made out of a very visible length of rope as it walked along. The sharpened stick that came out of the pile of refuse nearby bounced off of its armor. Olga sighed. The Death Series servitors couldn't detect any but the most painfully obvious of traps, and sometimes not even those. The Elder Liches could detect traces of magic if something came within range of their arcane vision, but the Beastmen's traps were completely mundane. Dull thumps filled the air after several blood-meat hulks were summoned and sent around to spring anything else that the Beastmen left behind. After that, they were sent to sweep the nearby fields. Several were destroyed by Beastmen that lay in ambush. "Don't chase them," Olga said. "Keep checking the area." They had tried, at first. The Beastmen's hunters stayed in the mud-mired fields where the undead suffered from difficult terrain that experienced rangers ignored, making them impossible to catch. Pursuit only led to more and more ambushes, all of them performed at range. Did they leave anyone behind? "The investigation is still in progress," the Elder Lich told her. "Given trends in our opponent's behavior, however, it is unlikely." As a part of her apprenticeship, Lady Zaradnik gave them a bunch of reading to do. Some books described how retreating armies would sometimes burn the territory they gave up to the enemy. Crops were burned. Animals were taken away. Stores of food and supplies were destroyed. This forced the advancing army to rely on its own supply lines. The undead didn't need supplies, but the Beastmen were acting to deny them their food nonetheless. Not long after Olga reached the border and started heading south, the Beastmen all at once started to carry the humans off with them. Even corpses weren't left behind, not even the bones left over from their meals. It didn't matter to the royal army that they were being denied corpses to animate, but it did matter that the Draconic Kingdom's citizens were being spirited away by the same effort. With so many Beastmen on the front, they had no shortage of individuals to carry them off with. An endless string of ambushes awaited any attempts at pursuing those so burdened. "Has the General Staff said anything about this yet?" "No recommendations have been made to our current procedures. This is going to take forever." Olga's northern front was 50 kilometers wide. There was a village roughly every 2 kilometers. Every village took 30 minutes to secure. Towns took hours. The change of pace felt like running into a wall since the Beastmen were only interested in fleeing in terror for weeks. Before she came to the Draconic Kingdom, she always thought that people who raised their conquests and killed everyone were horrible, evil people. Now she thought she could empathize. Even their fake occupation was a pain in the butt. She couldn't imagine how annoying a real one would be. "Squads 2, 3, and 4 are nearly in position," the Elder Lich said. Their skeletal dragon banked away from the recently conquered village as the undead continued its investigation. Olga twisted the ring of sustenance on her right middle finger. She had settled into a steady rotation between 3 sets of squads that went day and night as they methodically advanced toward Eastwatch. It was slower at night than it was during the day as no one could see beyond their respective dark vision ranges, and she constantly worried that she might miss some beastmen or a daring warband would sneak by and see what was going on behind the lines. The next location was yet another normal village about the same size as the previous one. She relayed any potentially problematic features to her sergeants before overseeing the assault. Each infantry squad formed up into their little shield boxes and the beastman skirmishers retreated before the undead advance. This time, however, something else happened. Olga leaned forward with a frown as the infantry squad slowed down and stopped. "What's going on?" "Our units are being subjected to crowd control effects," the Elder Lich replied. "Judging by appearances, it is the first-tier druid spell Entangle." Uck. Glazer could cast that one. It was annoying. Every plant in a designated area would come alive and try to entangle whatever got close enough. Even a blade of grass would elongate and become sturdier than rope. If a plant had thorns, was poisonous, or had any other contact effect, they would be included to deal damage and whatever else happened. Those that broke free would be attacked by other plants. Even if one could evade everything, the effort would slow them down by about half. Combined with the muddy terrain, it would make movement painfully slow. The Elder Liches are stuck, huh? Elder Liches were neither nimble enough to dodge the plants nor strong enough to break free once caught. Glazer got Nonna one time with the spell while she was experimenting with it. The Elder Lich had to wait out the effect, glaring all the while at the apologetic Dryad. "It is as you surmise," the Elder Lich said. "They are receiving assistance from the Death Warriors and Death Priests, but it is a persistent field effect." Are you timing it?" "We are uncertain how long ago the spells were cast, but yes." According to Glazer, one could tell how strong a magic caster was by the duration of certain spells that were commonly used. Once one figured that out, the basic power and duration of any spell that they cast could be estimated. Far below, the temporary shields of the Death Knights started to break. A fog cloud was summoned to obscure further attacks. Olga's gaze went from the group behind the mist and the perimeter of the village. The infantry squads were 100 meters farther from their objective than the previous group had been. "When did these stupid beastmen get so smart?" Olga muttered. The change in their tactics and overall strategy indicates the appearance of commanders who are accustomed to fighting the undead and incorporating magic into warfare. This event also suggests an understanding of broad mana logistics. A first-tier spell was being used to force the use of a second-tier spell prematurely, and another second-tier spell would have to be used to make up for the gap in cover created. "If this happens in every village," Olga asked, "will the Elder Liches be able to keep up?" "Mana should not be an issue, but the delays will greatly impact our strategic situation. This also assumes that they do not employ any other alterations to their methods." Which was highly doubtful. Once the veil of ignorance was lifted, it would lead to all sorts of new ideas and thinking. As a former subject of Reistais, Olga was all too familiar with that process. "Once they break out of the effect," Olga said, "have the squads change their approaches to the village. Walking straight from where they are will probably get them caught in more entangled spells." In addition to her precautions, the Elder Liches used Summon Undead 2 to conjure 4 skeletons each. They were sent ahead to check for more field effects. 15 minutes later, the infantry squads were poking around the village. This time, a death warrior fell into a pit of spikes. Those types of traps were especially weird. No matter how fast the victim was going, they still fell in as long as they were traveling on the ground. "Captain Zaradnik has called a meeting," the Elder Lich said. "When?" Olga asked. "She will be arriving at the designated meeting place in 2 hours. The place in question was a major town on the southern bank of Orakalon, just a few kilometers upriver from the lake. It would take about an hour and a half to fly there, so she left instructions with her sergeants to continue clearing villages before making her way over. The clouds had become dim with the approaching twilight by the time she landed in the town square, which had begun to fill with volunteer workers from the west. They gave Olga a wide berth as she and the Elder Lich walked over to the town hall. "Over here." Raoul's voice came out from one of the corridors branching from the way to the main hall. Olga's hands went to straighten her uniform as she went to join him. "I thought I beat you here," Olga said. "I didn't see your skeletal dragon in the plaza." "It's outside the west gate," Raoul replied. "I didn't want to get in the way of the people working here." "Oh." He led her down the hallway to a side office. Within, Baroness Zaradnik was standing behind a table already set up with a war map. To Olga's surprise, Queen Auriculus was there standing beside her. "What's she doing here?" She eyed the queen, who was both shorter and looked younger than her. An opaque black shawl lay over her shoulders atop a black one-piece dress. Her straight black hair glimmered with a sheen that appeared to devour the light of the room, and Olga could swear that her storm-dark eyes were shifting in hue. A wave of gooseflesh swept over Olga. Queen Auriculus was so cute and energetic-looking when Olga first saw her in Oraculon. Now, she looked dark and brooding. She couldn't help but feel that there was some unfathomable danger lurking behind the queen's cold, pristine appearance. "It seems you're encountering all sorts of difficulties," Lady Zaradnik said. "Yes, Captain," Olga replied as she went to stand beside Raoul. "They're doing all sorts of things to slow us down." "Did Raoul?" Her words died on her lips as she took in the details on the map. The riverlands south of the Oraculon had been taken all the way to the border, and Raoul's forces were positioned across the river from Eastwatch. How did you do that?" I just did the same thing as before," Raoul replied with a puzzled look. "The beastmen weren't resisting our advance on the south side," Lady Zaradnik said. "Raoul was able to sweep everything up while they consolidated at Eastwatch." "It still feels like I did that all for nothing," Raoul grumbled. That wasn't the case at all, but Olga could see why he felt that way. A mix of roughly 60,000 beastmen warriors and civilians had escaped out of the corridor south of Corin on the lake. This was in addition to another 100,000 beastmen occupying the southern riverlands between the city and the border. He may have gotten rid of most of them, but there were just as many beastmen in the Draconic Kingdom now as there were when they had first arrived. "That's not all you've done," the Queen smiled up at him. "500,000 of our subjects have also been secured thanks to your work." Raoul nodded silently in response. Olga stared down glumly at the table. Faye. She had read enough histories by now that she knew what it would look like. Raoul would be credited with facing the most powerful beastman offensive at the Battle of Corin on the lake before moving on to get rid of over 100,000 more, saving 500,000 people and finishing his mission as the commander of the Southern Wing. Meanwhile, Olga had snuck into the city through the river to strike at the helpless civilians during the battle, and then she returned to her side of the front and got stuck. "More reports have come in since you left the northern front," Lady Zaradnik said. "It appears that the beastmen are employing all sorts of new tactics. They've been effective enough with them that the entire strategic situation is starting to change." "I don't get it, Captain," Raoul said. "Why are they just doing this now? Things would have been way harder if they did it from the beginning." "That's still a mystery," the Baroness said. "Most would probably say that it's due to the new arrivals, but even that doesn't make sense. The warfare conducted so far is characteristic of raiding cultures, which should be expected of opponents of this nature. What's going on now represents a drastic shift from that style. For lack of a better word, they're fighting conventionally." "They did it at Corin on the lake," Raoul noted. "Corin on the lake was very rudimentary," Lady Zaradnik said. "Though they were amassed into armies, the warbands still fought in ways akin to raiding parties. From what the intelligence division could glean from the beastmen that we've captured over the weeks, Corin on the lake was the headquarters of the clan leading the invasion, which was headed by what everyone calls a war master. That war master was apparently responsible for the swift and highly organized invasion up to River Garden, but he fell to a teleportation ambush not long after. What we saw the other day may have been the vestiges of his influence. The invasion of the Draconic Kingdom was weird, in many ways. One could say that it was pretty nice as far as invasions went right up until the point that the beastmen's leader was killed. It was like that one guy was holding everything together and it all fell apart the moment he died. Some stories were like that, but Olga thought that they were a bit stupid. At least until she became a commander and saw it happen firsthand on multiple occasions. Unlike raiders, Lady Zaradnik continued, who pursue tactical objectives and only happen to affect strategic change, the beastmen now are pursuing strategic goals. They are functioning as a professional military in a developed state would. Does your Majesty know about any other fronts that the beastmen have that could cultivate this type of warfare? We know little about their current state, Queen Auriculus replied. Over their long history with the Draconic Kingdom, they have only been raiders, as you put it. The most recent invasion was the first time that they could be considered an army, and that only lasted for as long as the War Master did. The Queen let out a sigh, and a tiny frown crossed her pale lips. In hindsight, ordering the death of that War Master fellow was a terrible thing. Killing off a leader in the hopes that the enemy would fall to chaos doesn't work so well when that chaos happens to you. I would almost say that we're facing another one of these War Masters, the Baroness said, but there are oddities even when one factors that in. Their mystics are straying out of the conventional healer role that tribes tend to attribute to them, and their countermeasures against undead propagation feel almost standardized. Maybe their country is so large that different parts of it can have drastically different styles of warfare. An elder lich came up beside Lady Zaradnik and lightly cleared its throat. It presented a scroll in its desiccated hand. Orders from the General Staff, it said. They waited in silence as the Baroness unfurled the scroll and silently read its content. She set it on an unoccupied corner of the map before speaking again. We're to begin our assault on Eastwatch tonight, she said. But the forces north of the Orichalon are still so far away, Olga frowned. It's going to be a long battle, Lady Zaradnik replied. The northern and western fronts will slow their approach. Raoul will gain control of the Orichalon and begin interdicting all river traffic. No additional supplies or personnel will be permitted to reach the beastmen at Eastwatch. We're laying siege to the city, Captain? Raoul asked. No, the Baroness shook her head. Intelligence estimates that there are still 200,000 of the Draconic Kingdom's citizens under beastman control. If we try to starve them out, they'll eat the citizens. What we're doing is applying pressure to their position. The reason why the assault begins now is that we're being allotted room to maneuver. It's hard to maneuver at all with their new tactics, Captain, Olga said. They're way more aware of what's going on now, as well. Lady Zaradnik picked a plotting rod up off of the table, using it to move some of Raoul's pieces around. I spoke with Lord Mayor about what's going on, she said. On the magical side of things, they're putting some simple principles to effective use. The spells that they are using are either irresistible or have secondary effects that cannot be resisted. Entangle, for instance, does not target our forces, it targets the ground. The affected plants then reach out to impede whatever they can reach, turning the spell into a physical obstacle for all intents and purposes. That makes it sound even more annoying, Olga said. We can't do anything about it aside from praying our forces don't enter affected areas. You and I won't need to do all that much for now, Lady Zaradnik replied. The tactics that the beastmen are relying on depend on us advancing into areas that they've prepared traps and ambushes in. With as many beastmen as there are, it's undesirable to shrink the battlefield much further anyway. How many are there now? Raoul asked. 600,000 according to the latest estimates. Raoul's mouth fell open. Olga actively resisted doing the same. The Baroness smiled at their reaction. Raoul should only need 1 or 2 squads to secure the canyon. She pointed at the markers placed at the entrance to the Draconic Kingdom. The remainder will deploy as you see here. Those spells that you saw the beastmen using do not work in the water, so we will attack from the rivers. As long as the enemy is close, Raoul's ambushes will be undetectable right up until the point that he strikes. We will be on the offensive all day and all night. Any respite that the beastmen gain will be at the expense of their comrades. Our enclosure will be adjusted as their numbers shrink. Lady Zaradnik used her rod to circle the 600 square kilometer area hemmed in by the Sorceress Kingdom's royal army. The very annoying situation that Olga had been facing suddenly turned into an utterly pitiful one for the beastmen. This will be our killing field, the Baroness said. Let's get to work. 29th day, Middle Wind Month, 1 CE, Khostak. Hey. How big of a shit are you taking? Ludmilla wasn't sure how badly Khostak had to go, but he certainly wasn't concerned about that sort of thing anymore. The Nar shouting for his comrade approached the riverbank, following a foot trail leading down from the Draconic Kingdom's central highway. He stopped at a stand of reeds, where he rose to his full height to look around. A death warrior lying under the water popped up and snatched him. They both disappeared back into the river with a splash. Somewhere under the surface, the beastman was probably joining his comrade as a zombie. She looked up to where Raoul was loitering just inside the low-hanging clouds. It's nice and sneaky as far as Death Series servitors are concerned, but if it takes 10 minutes to take down 2 beastmen, we're going to be here for 6 years. Maybe I should send them to apprentice under Gunnar for a season or 2. Ludmilla wasn't entirely sure if it resulted from her instruction or influence, but Raoul and Olga both took actions that demonstrated a desire for controlled situations. Raoul was more offensively minded than his fellow apprentice, but he still took steps to ensure things stayed within a relatively tight range of expectations. The problem was that doing things that way was slow. They also needed things to spin out of control because it was their enemy, not them, that was currently in control. Gunnar was very good at breaking apart orderly affairs, as he had proven so many times against her, and Ludmilla was sure that he was the best choice for commanding the assault on Eastwatch. That thought led her to another. There was a problem that wasn't Ludmilla or her apprentice's fault. The general staff was getting greedy. Gunnar's proposals were turned down because knowledge and experience had become the primary objective of the campaign in the Draconic Kingdom, while their foreign affairs objective had become a secondary primary objective if that made any sense. Failure was unacceptable for either, yet the former was far more important to the Royal Army. A high degree of control was favored because it made it easier to isolate important bits of information. The fields surrounding Eastwatch had become their new and improved laboratory, and Ludmilla was to create as many points of data as possible while at the same time fulfilling the royal court's desire for a swift conclusion to the conflict. Doing that while also preserving the lives of the Draconic Kingdom's remaining captive citizens caused expectations to cross the line into unrealistic. Victory was ensured because Lord Tian was available if required, but the General Staff wanted him to stay out of the battle unless his intervention was absolutely necessary. Hers was only one small opinion in deciding what was necessary, of course. Well, there's no point in moping about it. At least one thing was made clear by their current deployment: not a single beastman in Eastwatch would be going home. They were to be slaughtered for the sake of the experience that the General Staff desired. She waited for a while longer to see if more beastmen would come looking for their missing comrades. When nothing happened for 5 minutes, she flew up to join Raoul. "Come up with anything interesting?" she asked. "Having the river to use as cover is nice, Captain," Raoul answered, "but it's still hard to do anything in the dark. They can't see us and we can't see them, so it all feels kind of dumb." Ludmilla could see everything that wasn't physically concealed just fine thanks to her true sight, but it was a problem that the Royal Army's other commanders would have to face in night operations. "What you're doing is basically raiding," she told him, "so you should get into that mindset. You may strike wherever you can reach. Your goal isn't to win back Eastwatch, but to bleed the beastmen dry while constantly keeping them off balance. Eastwatch will fall into our hands after they fall apart." Aside from being able to stay underwater indefinitely, the undead had several other advantages as raiders. Logistical concerns that made traditional raiding parties predictable, such as securing sources of water, food and safe places to rest, were non-existent. Their limitless stamina allowed them to be uneconomical with their energy, whereas the living needed to expend theirs prudently. "So I can be totally random and there's no need to be sneaky?" "Not unless you believe that there is a danger to your forces that can effectively respond to your moves. Also, being too conspicuous will inform your targets and any scouts that they deploy, though you may use that to your advantage as well." As odd as it seemed, Ludmilla was actually better at raiding than nearly any other form of warfare. This was partially because she was a ranger, a vocation that was peerless at skirmishing and operating outside of urban areas. Additionally, learning about how one's neighbors conducted raids was part of the core of her education, making her intimately familiar with the topic and its nuances. Raoul, on the other hand, came from one of the inland territories. In terms of violent threats, the people there were more concerned with petty thugs who were often not that much superior to their victims. "What about that?" He gestured at a cluster of campfires further east. "We're not securing any villages, so I can just attack whoever's standing outside, right?" "Your proposal is not without its merits," Ludmilla said, "but are you sure you want to attack that one?" The boy furrowed his brow as he frowned down at his selection. "I don't get it," he said. "The purpose of this type of warfare is to exploit or create openings, keep one's opponent off balance, and cause logistical issues. By all appearances, Eastwatch is their headquarters, their center of balance. The closer you strike to their center of balance, the harder you'll have to hit them to knock them off balance." So the further away I hit them from their headquarters, Raoul said, the faster and lighter I can make my strikes. Since they use runners and verbal communication to pass information around, their reactions become super clumsy. That's right, Ludmilla nodded. They're not conducting independent operations as warbands anymore, they're trying to function as a cohesive army. They might look coordinated at a glance, but their instructions are being kept simple to not complicate things. Stall the undead, skirmish without taking losses, don't leave any bodies behind? That includes the Draconic Kingdom's citizens. Something like that. Raoul crossed his arms as he looked out over the left wing of his skeletal dragon. After a moment, he looked over his shoulder to his elder lich. Let's go west, he said, close to the front. The skeletal dragon banked in a wide circle over the Orichalon and followed the river toward friendly lines. Roughly 4 kilometers away from Ludmilla's forces, Raoul pointed to a village on the riverbank. What about that one? He asked. How do you plan on attacking them? We don't want them to run away, so I guess we have to cut off their escape first. But there are beastmen in the copses and windbreaks between the villages, so our squads will get spotted. Why do you think that matters? Ludmilla asked. Because they'll warn everyone nearby, Raoul answered. And what happens when that happens? Raoul fell silent. His eyes rested on the collection of fires in the village. Beyond that, he wouldn't be able to see much since it wasn't safe to fly within his goggles' dark vision range of the ground. If we attack them, he said, some will die and some will run. If they give up their positions, what those positions used to be able to see becomes a hole in their information. After that, it becomes easier for us to do more. Very good, Ludmilla smiled. Sometimes, it's just easier to create cracks in your opponent's defenses than it is to find them. This isn't some puzzle that's meant to be solved in the way that the commander employing it intends to have it solved. It's designed to be as unsolvable as possible in the first place. Once cracks start to appear, however, what was at first your problem becomes theirs. With the power of their infantry squads, any attempts at making cracks would probably result in holes instead. Now that they had ample time to question the beastmen that had been captured, it seemed that Rolengork, what the beastmen called their home, didn't have any individuals significantly much stronger than the lord that they captured in Corin on the lake. This made the general staff more confident in their threat assessments, and made Sigurd storm off in disappointment, but it spoke of several other things to Ludmilla. First was that it was not the characteristic tribal culture that most demi-humans had in the region. It had evolved into a more organized, expansive entity, a tribal confederation. The migration into the Draconic Kingdom wasn't some disjointed effort driven by sheer inertia, but something that the entire confederation contributed to. A military force sufficient to make the venture a success was raised from all corners of Rolengork and placed under a unified chain of command. Substantial logistical support continued to flow from their home jungles, forging trade links throughout the eastern half of the Draconic Kingdom. Now that a major threat in the form of the undead had appeared, they were provided with an overwhelming amount of additional military support. Ludmilla couldn't help but wonder what things would be like if House Zaradnik and the other frontier houses had been offered the same support by Riestais. What was the difference? The dividing line appeared to be the fact that the martial houses of the beastmen remained prominent in their collective leadership, much like how the martial houses of the Empire evolved into the core of the Imperial Army. Riestais somehow forgot that martial strength was required to protect the interests of a country, or was made to forget. It all goes back to the theocracy's policies, huh? She once vehemently disliked that conclusion, but there was too much evidence to support it. Riestais had fallen completely into the theocracy's cleverly structured trap. They had become little more than a farm where the finest products were catalogued and earmarked for export. The Empire was trying to break out of that trap, but the Imperial Army on its own wasn't enough. Thus, the theocracy could rest assured that its influence over it was secure. Roblé was stuck between its wall and the sea, and the demi-humans of the Abelian Hills acted as a great whetstone that conveniently separated the wheat from the chaff. The Draconic Kingdom faced the most extreme situation where a highly resilient, yet theocracy-dependent population of humans was being raised. She wondered how many promising humans had been whisked away to the theocracy instead of being allowed to help their country resist the beastmen over the generations. Possibly the cruelest irony was that the forces sent to assist the Draconic Kingdom likely contained former citizens of the Draconic Kingdom, and the Draconic Kingdom was paying the Theocracy for the strength that the Theocracy had stolen from them in the first place. Once, Ludmilla saw the Great Seeding after the demon gods as an inspiring venture to ensure humanity's survival in a hostile world. Now, it only seemed like an act undertaken for cruel and exploitative ends. Not only was each country robbed of its finest harvests, but the non-humans of the region were constantly crushed under the Theocracy's boot, never allowed to advance beyond a state of tribal subsistence. That situation had changed, however. One by one, the human nations of the region were being wrested from the Theocracy's grip by the Sorceress Kingdom. The demi-humans of the region were also finding themselves freed from violent oppression. Once they were finished liberating the Draconic Kingdom, all that was left was Reasties, and the Theocracy's carefully laid plans would be all but dismantled. One day, a great reckoning would come for the Theocracy, orchestrated by the God of Justice himself. Squads 21 to 24 have assembled, the Elder Lich riding behind Raoul said. They await your orders. Raoul had gathered every infantry squad assigned to the Oracle on side of the enclosure. 2 squads were in the canyon sinking ships while the remaining 4 were on the eastern side. 21 will attack the village, Raoul said. The others will move in to block the eastern side after the attack starts to catch the ones attempting to retreat. Don't go after any beastmen alerted east of their positions. The sub-commander stared down at the darkness as he waited for his squads to take their starting positions. They were all in the water, so even Ludmilla couldn't figure out where they were. Aren't you forgetting something? She asked. Forgetting? Oh. Summon some wraiths to scout ahead, or will they get caught? Have you been harassing them with wraiths this entire time? No. Well, that's no good, Ludmilla said. You shouldn't let Elder Liches idle with full mana pools in an active war zone. Not only will they help with battlefield awareness, but any damage or drains that they inflict take a toll on the beastmen's mana, the same mana that they've been using to place their magical obstacles. Does this mean my attack isn't going to work? Raoul asked. It's going to hurt either way, Ludmilla answered. Also, my Elder Liches have kept up wraith harassment this entire time, so a few more around this village probably won't be seen as anything out of the ordinary. She waited as Raoul issued orders to his forces. The beastmen had adapted well to sets of wraiths appearing to attack them now and then. Once, they slept inside buildings that the spectral undead could slip into and kill without being noticed. Now, they rested outside under the watchful eye of their fellows. A series of growls, roars, barks and yelps issued from the village and its surroundings as Raoul's scouts swept over the target area. This one has noted an anomaly, Raoul's adjutant said. The village's buildings appear to be vacated. Then where did the humans go? Raoul frowned. Unknown. Ludmilla scanned the scenery below, but she didn't spot any humans collected for safekeeping. Did any of the other scouting parties sent out come across any citizens? Ludmilla asked. Several minutes passed before the Elder Lich provided an answer. They appeared to be gathered closer to Eastwatch, but reconnaissance is incomplete due to interception. That means there aren't any humans on the outskirts, right? Raoul said. None have been detected thus far. Olga, have your wraiths check the buildings along the front. Some of the Elder Liches are reporting that the Draconic Kingdom's citizens have been relocated. Squads 15, 16, and 17, prepare to advance. Squad 16 will storm the village ahead of you. Raoul, make sure your interdiction forces aren't sinking ships loaded with humans. Right, Raoul nodded. What do we do if we do find ships full of humans, Captain? Start breaking those paddle wheels of theirs instead of sinking the ships. Their rudders, too. They'll lose control and the current will send them back this way. We have plenty of free Elder Lich controllers in reserve. They can use the dominated undead to sink the ships that we don't want getting past us. Get rid of the beastmen operating any vessels loaded with humans and mark those ships to be guided to Corin on the lake. Captain, Sub-Commander Olga is reporting similar findings on the northern front, Psycho told her. It's nice that they've become so serious about trying to starve us of corpses, Ludmilla smirked. Send our squads in, Raoul ordered. Tell them they don't have to worry about human casualties here. What about property damage? The Elder Lich asked. Raoul sent a look in Ludmilla's direction. Don't raise any villages to the ground, she answered. We might be able to reuse them later. Minor damage is acceptable. Far below, the infantry squad started surfacing from the river. The one approaching the village was spotted immediately. Low roars filled the air, an alarm that seemed to carry for kilometers around them. Thousands of beastmen scrambled to respond to the attack. A crackling blue arc of electricity exploded out of the darkness, reflected against the water on its way to punch through dozens of beastmen who had taken up positions on the village pier. The ambushing Elder Lich ducked behind the shield of a nearby Death Knight, and bullets clanked off of the dark metal before both undead submerged themselves. Squads 15, 16, and 17, commence your assault. After issuing her orders, she examined the aftermath of the lightning ambush. About half, Ludmilla murmured. Was that maximized? Yes, Captain, Raoul's adjutant replied. It appears that the average beastman warrior will not survive the spell if they do not dodge it. I doubt they'll line up so nicely for long, Ludmilla said, but that may not matter with so many running around. The Death Knight resurfaced. It was immediately pelted by a storm of bullets. A bead of flame streaked in from the side, engulfing dozens of hunters attacking from the shore in a fireball. The Elder Lich hadn't appeared with the Death Knight, instead resurfacing to hit the distracted beastmen from a different angle. It submerged again as soon as it cast its spell, leaving the beastmen to run around in flames and confusion. Ludmilla's lip twitched. Who thought that one up? She asked. We were trying to figure out how to get Elder Liches in range to cast spells without being smashed by bullets, Raoul said. When we practiced this, none of our defenders could ever figure out which way they would be attacked from, so we figured the beastmen wouldn't be able to, either. Especially in the dark. It should work for a while, she nodded, so long as there aren't too many eyes on the water. An especially strong hunter would probably be able to react to retaliate to the real attack, as well. Once they learn about this trick, having more Death Knights pop up, one hiding the Elder Lich, would probably make this tactic very difficult to deal with. Another lightning spell ripped across the riverbank before the advancing Death Knights stormed onto the shore with their squire zombies. They spread out to enter the village, cutting down beastman warriors as they went. The squire zombies that were destroyed were quickly replaced, but they couldn't seem to accumulate any regular zombies. The infantry squad wasn't even halfway through the village before calls for retreat reached Ludmilla's ears. As expected, they retreated to safety, which happened to be straight into the 3 squads Raoul positioned east of the village. She wasn't sure if the beastmen nearby warned the others of their presence, but the retreating forces certainly hadn't noticed in the chaos of the assault. You might be able to keep some zombies this time, Ludmilla said as she watched the bodies pile up. But even the squire zombies don't seem very survivable. Captain, Psycho informed her, squads 15, 16 and 17 have completed their mission. Should I just send them into the river, Captain? Raoul asked. Just the ones with a respectable number of zombies, Ludmilla answered. We can try again with the others. You should complete the encirclement, by the way. Encirclement? Oh. Squads 22 to 24, head north to complete the cordon with the captain's forces. Squads 18, 19, 20 and 21, clean up this pocket. Raoul, Ludmilla said, go ahead and oversee the cleanup. I'll stay here at the new perimeter. Are you sure? They're mostly your squads. I can spot beastmen trying to slip by, she told him. You can't. That will always be the case until we get a proper force of scouts to support our main battle line. Raoul and his adjutant saluted before flying west. Ludmilla repositioned herself to get a better view of the entire cordon. About 10 square kilometers and 20,000 beastmen, she said. Not a bad start. As the encirclement shrunk, the gaps between each squad would get tighter, as well. She was still wary of beastmen slipping through to attack them from the rear or just run amok in their reserves, so the faster it happened, the better. Will our objectives be achieved by repeating these maneuvers, Captain? Psycho asked. I doubt that the beastman leadership will just sit there and let us do it over and over again, Ludmilla answered. It will probably only be this easy tonight. In that case, will you be attempting to gain as much ground as possible? Ideally. I'd like to cut the encircled area by half so the gaps in our lines aren't so huge. It probably won't happen, though. A mix of beastman noises drifted in from the west as Raoul started his cleanup operation. She wondered how far the sound carried. A part of her hoped it would reach Eastwatch to unsettle the beastman defenders, but it would also prematurely inform them of what was going on. More rain would probably fix that. Do you believe that they will conduct a counteroffensive? It's entirely possible, Ludmilla replied. The fact of the matter is that we haven't seen enough of this defensive style of theirs to say for certain. What we do know is that these beastmen have traits that naturally favor offense, so it seems like a waste for them to not take advantage of it. Of course, that might also mean that they defended aggressively, but that sort of commander was rare. At least amongst humans. She was the only one that she could think of. A swarm of dots came running up the highway. Ludmilla pulled a longbow out of the infinite haversack on her right hip. Beastmen approaching by way of the main highway. They'll be coming up the rural roads as well. Watch out for hunters sneaking through the fields. Help coordinate the forces at the highway, she told Psycho. I'm going to patrol our lines. Ludmilla shed altitude, dropping to 50 meters over the fields. She knocked a glass arrow to her bowstring as she patrolled for beastman hunters. It wasn't long until she started spotting them. One pair heading straight east in Squad 24's direction. North side of the road. They didn't seem to notice her as she crossed overhead, but that was to be expected. She was flying at around the limit of Ilishnish's detection, and Ludmilla couldn't imagine any beastman present having keener senses than the frost dragon. After reporting 24 more sets of hunters, her flight slowed. Strong Osalo hunter approaching Squad 17 through the vineyard northeast of the road. Approximately difficulty rating 80. Would they be able to detect it? With the vineyard as cover, probably not. She flew after it from behind, but it was faster on the ground than she was in the air. Thankfully, it slowed down, crouching low to improve its concealment as 2 Death Knights entered the vineyard, walking a few rows to either side. On the road that they came from, a Death Priest watched for signs of their target. Prepare a hold species spell. It's about to cross the road. The 2 Death Knights doubled back. The Osalo hunter paused at the edge of the vineyard, eyeing the Death Priest as if pondering if it could sneak by. Ludmilla's arrow shattered against its back and it jumped in fright, its fur standing on end. A second later, the alchemist's fire soaked into its fur ignited. A yowling screech filled the air and it twisted about in a panic. Hold species. The spell froze the Osalo in place. The 2 Death Knights came out to join the Death Priest, quietly watching the paralyzed beastman burn. The poor thing couldn't even scream. An appetizing aroma filled the air, and the Death Priest looked at Ludmilla, sticking up its thumb in approval. I didn't mean for it to turn out that way. Put it out of its misery already. A horrifically burnt squire zombie rose a minute later. Ludmilla resumed her patrol, silently shaking her head. She always seemed to do the most atrocious things without actively thinking about them. 3 hours later, the beastmen in the pocket stopped trickling into the squads awaiting them. She rejoined Raoul above the river. Sweat covered the boy's brow and his breathing was slightly labored. Are you all right? Ludmilla asked. There was just a lot to do, Raoul answered. I thought it'd be like Corin on a lake, but it wasn't. Beastmen were running everywhere and everything wanted my attention now. I couldn't make sense of all the battles that were going on at once. Some of the squads got completely split up in the fighting. It was chaos? Raoul nodded. I believe that was the point, Ludmilla said. You are creating chaos to break apart order and transforming that chaos into a new order. Having a good idea of what that new order will look like will help you guide your troops more effectively, and those troops do rely on your guidance. Soldiers in the thick of fighting focus on achieving specific tactical objectives using whatever means are available to them. The General Staff concerns itself with strategy overall. As a commander in the field, your main task is to facilitate both sides. I never read about any of this, Raoul said. Because the histories primarily concern themselves with the end result, Ludmilla replied. I dare say that the result is all that matters to most because they believe that it is the only thing that affects their lives. If it doesn't affect their lives at all, they're not likely to care beyond what entertainment value it offers. That aside, the details of past conflicts tend to only be known by those directly involved because they are usually kept a secret by the belligerents. Telling others exactly how one fights isn't exactly wise. Specific details will only be made known by a country if they can be used as a political tool. At some point, I should take you two to our winter to take a look at the Imperial Military Academy's archives. You'll see how different things can be from the histories. They would have to build up their own archives, as well. The limits of using publicly accessible knowledge for education were all too easily reached. In the fields and vineyards along the riverbank, Raoul's forces gathered, awaiting further orders. Ludmilla cast her gaze over the battlefield, to the northeastern corner of their encirclement. "We have one more chance to do this before dawn," she said. "Let's get more practice in while we can."